Hello there, class. This is a video on how to do a word study. And again, this is very rudimentary, very introductory, but it gives you an idea as you move from elementary Greek into Greek exegesis eventually, just some of the tools and what the process is. So this is about discovering the meaning of Greek words. This is actually a quote from a book on biblical interpretation by Klein, Bloomberg, and Hubbard. But this is what they say. The correct interpretation of Scripture is the meaning required by the normal meaning of the words in the context in which they occur. Well, this is a very good quote, and there's a few interesting aspects to this quote. It's saying a lot. The correct interpretation, that is, how do we determine the meaning of Scripture? It's the meaning of the words that we find within the text, and this is what they call the normal meaning. The normal meaning is, again, certain words I would say have kind of a range of meaning, different pathways they can take, and the way to determine your possible meaning within the passage is in the context. So there are possibilities of meaning, but it is limited by the context in which that word occurs. That's an important point of doing word studies, because oftentimes we focus on this range of meaning. Well, there's all these possibilities for the meaning of this word, but we often forget that they occur within a context, and that context is so very important for understanding what exactly the correct interpretation. What's the author trying to get at here in what he's writing? So I'm going to take you through the steps of doing a word study, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the pitfalls that you might run into. So what you want to do is, as you study your Greek text, you look for words that are theologically loaded. For instance, dikaiosune. The dikaiosune is a word for righteousness. And that's so very important within Paul's writing, also within Matthew's Gospel, and several places in the New Testament. It's important that you understand what this word is getting at. We often have in our mind what it means, but let's try to understand what the possibilities of meaning are and in the context that the author is writing. We want to look at ambiguous words. We might look at a word and the meaning itself is ambiguous. And how do you know that? Well, when you're studying the Greek text, take a look at English translations of your Greek text. And if there's a wide variance in how they handle a particular Greek word, then you're going to have to try to figure this out. So for instance, this is the word for flesh. Sarx is the word for flesh. This is a word that's used a lot within Paul's writings. He talks a lot about the flesh. What exactly does he mean by the flesh? Is he talking about our physical body when he talks about the flesh warring against us? Or is he talking about, as some translators go, our sinful nature, the old sinful nature? That is a word that if you're dealing with a particular text and if it's there, you ought to look into it, see exactly what's going on. And again, that word sarx might be used differently by different New Testament authors. John may, in his Gospel, may use the word sarx, but it may be a different nuance than what Paul is giving. You might also want to study repeated words. So you're reading a passage in Greek, and the author is repeating a certain word, or let's say he repeats the noun related to that meaning of that word, but he also uses the verbal idea, or he might use another part of speech to convey similar meaning there. He's repeating similar ideas within the passage. You may want to look into those words. And finally, rare words ought to be looked into. And their commentaries will point out to you that this word only occurs one time in the New Testament or two times in the New Testament. That might be a word that you might want to look into and try to figure out what's going on there. So after you've got your list of words you want to look at, go back to the context. And again, I'm always a fan of, looking at the context and looking for clues within the context. So observe the meaning and most of all what the function of the word is in its context. So particularly what part of speech it is in the sentence, or is it in a place where the author has real emphasis? So as you look at the passage, kind of think about syntactically how the parts are working together within the larger whole. And again, is this particular word a point of emphasis for the author? Is it just a kind of an expansion of an idea? Those things are important to look at. The next step is to begin to do some research with secondary resources. The main resources that I'm going to talk about are lexicons, dictionaries, and concordances. All can be found in the reference section in Tyndale Library. Some of them are accessible online, and they're also a good idea to maybe have one or more of these in your own personal library if you wish to study the Greek text more in depth. But before we get there, I want to talk about two types of word analysis. Diachronic is through time. So this is where someone studies the use of a word from its earliest occurrences, earlier passages onward. And another way to look at a word is synchronic, and that is within its time. So studying the use of the word within the author's time. So you'll see your word study resources employ both these methods. They look at the word, so they'll look at a New Testament word, and they'll go back to what we might say classical Greek usage. So the question is the classical use in keeping with the New Testament use, or again, has the language evolved? And that's the big question, right? It's probably not appropriate to use the same meaning, say, that maybe Aristotle used for a Greek word and transfer that over to Paul and say, well, Paul is using the same meaning here. We have many, many years of time between Aristotle and Paul, and the question is, would they have had the same understanding of that word? Or did that word have the same meaning even in Paul's day that it did in Aristotle's day? Because language evolves, meaning changes. The other way, and the way that I think is probably a better way, being aware of this is important, but a better way of studying the word is within the author's time. So think about the New Testament time. So we want to maybe look at how the author of that New Testament book uses that word. So if we're dealing with Paul, we've got lots of material to work with. We can compare Paul to a word he uses in Romans to the same word he's using in 1 Corinthians. Although note that even between epistles, words can be used slightly differently, and we have to be aware of that. So look within the New Testament text and see how words are used and understood. You can also, you can also look at the Septuagint, and again, noting Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And again, many of the New Testament authors, in fact, quote Septuagint text, probably were aware or reading Septuagint text. So again, they're aware of the nuances of the language from the Septuagint. So that's important to note too. And there are other secular authors that may use words in certain ways that we want to refer to. So within the time of the author, that's probably the most fertile ground and the best place to go when studying a word. The first one resource that I want to talk about is Bauer's Lexicon. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich. It's the Oxford Dictionary of the Greek New Testament, and it's an alphabetical listing of every Greek word that's used in the New Testament. It gives extensive information on the meaning of the words, and it uses both diachronic and synchronic analysis. It can be a bit daunting to read when you first look at it. Now, the newer edition, which I have pictured here, is much better than earlier editions at cleaning up the look of the entries, and so it's easier to distill information from the newer, just by looking at it in the newer edition than the older edition. But if you have the older edition, you can still gain much information from it if you are patient and you can look through it. The next key resource are what are called theological dictionaries. So there are kind of two main ones that I use. There's the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, pictured here. It's a multi-volume dictionary that has been the standard for much time. It's an older resource, and some would argue it's theologically biased as well, but still much good information can be gleaned from it if you read critically. So that's edited by Kittel, and it's called Kittel. But he's the editor, and there are several authors that have contributed to articles within this theological dictionary. And the other one is the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, and that's been re-edited by Moises Silva. Originally, it was Colin Brown who edited this multi-volume work. It's also quite good, so I recommend both. So this resource provides word study information. So much like Bauer's Lexicon, it traces the word both diachronically and synchronically. It looks at the use of the word, but it also provides a theological interpretation. So when dealing with both religious texts primarily, it gives kind of a theological or religious interpretation of the word. So it's a valuable resource for that kind of analysis. And finally, you want to consult a Greek concordance. Now, everyone here knows what concordances are. So it's a listing of words. So a particular word like hope. And in English ones, it'll list all the texts in the Bible where hope occurs, both OT and new T. Okay, so you have a concordance will do that. But the Greek, if you have a Greek concordance, you'll see Elpis. You can look up Elpis, and it will list all the New Testament passages where Elpis, hope, occurs. And that's valuable because you can, again, begin to see, okay, how do the gospel writers use Elpis? How does Paul use Elpis? How does John's epistles? So you can isolate the word Elpis, how it's used by the different authors, and that, again, is helpful to do synchronic analysis of a Greek word. So you get to the final step, you have all this research and information. You've got to kind of choose the most probable meaning of the word. So again, Klein, Blueberg, and Hubbard provide this wonderful quote. The use of the word in a specific context constitutes the single most critical or crucial criterion for the meaning of the word. So you do this research, and what you're going to find is that there's a range of meaning. This word can be used in many different ways. But when you get to the context, you're going to have to play a game of eliminating. So you're going to say, okay, that meaning doesn't work here. That meaning doesn't work here. This meaning works best in the context, and come up and make a decision on the word. Finally, I want to note some common errors that occur in Greek word studies. Common errors that you often hear preachers who really don't know their Greek well, but they refer to it enough to impress people. Please don't fall into these pitfalls. There's the etymological fallacy, and that is, let's break down a Greek word according to its etymology and do analysis. So, ekklesia. Ekklesia is the word in the New Testament for church. But some preachers will say, oh, if we break down the etymology of this word, it means the called out ones. Okay, well, I guess, if you break down the etymology. But, and that may be the etymology, but that probably was not the meaning in most people's minds, especially Paul's readers, when they read ekklesia in his letters. The common translation in Paul's words for ekklesia was assembly. Now in the Septuagint, the term ekklesia referred to God's people, the covenant, the assembly of God's people. So the congregation of Israel. So again, don't fall in that etymological fallacy. Illegitimate totality transfer, that's a fancy one for saying don't pour all the possible meanings of a single word back into the occurrence that you find in the text. So again, you're going to find a range of meaning for a word. Don't take that range of meaning and plunk it into the context and say, well, this word means all these things in this passage. I guess it might. There might be some double entendre being used here, or multiple nuances. But for the most part, an author wants a singular meaning within his text. He doesn't want multiple meanings that are going to be confusing for the reader. And don't engage in anachronism. So don't look at a New Testament word, just like it's not proper to take a word from Aristotle and read the same meaning into Paul. By the same token, don't take, say, a meaning of a word from the Church Fathers and read it back in the New Testament era. Again, time has changed, history has changed, the meaning of the word has changed in some ways. So be aware of that too. And finally, don't engage in uncritical use of resources. All these guys, Bauer, Kittel, and Silva, all these guys that wrote these or edited these books or contributed articles to these things, all these guys are human beings who are studying the text and doing their very best to understand the Greek word, but they're not infallible. So don't engage in uncritical use. Always have your thinking cap on, and always think about the text and the word that's being used, and question what you're reading. Okay, well, that's everything about Greek word studies. I'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but that's the basic idea around doing word studies. Okay.